All right, so for this section, we're going to learn how to multiply and divide radical expressions. So to begin with, let me complete this parentheses. Let me multiply the term on the outside to the term on the inside. When they are two radicals, when they like terms, right? Whole numbers with whole numbers, I will multiply it. Radicals with radicals, I will multiply it. Now, a radical with a whole number, I cannot multiply it, so I'm just going to write both of them. So this gives me 2 square root of 5, right, plus square root of 30. Notice how when I went radical with a whole number, I couldn't combine them, so I just wrote both of them. Radical with a radical, I multiplied them. If you can simplify the radical, by all means do so. In this case, we cannot. So I'm just going to leave it at that. 2 square root of 5 plus square root of 30. Now let's take a look at the bottom. 4 times square root of 12. I'm just going to call that 4 square root of 12. Now here, I'm going to have minus 4 square root of 27. I mentioned in the previous example that if you can simplify your radicals, do so. Remember, I'm dealing with perfect squares, so I'm dealing with square root. So I know 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16, on and on. So I'm going to break this as 4, my 4 on the front. Now square root of 12, I'm going to break that as 4 times 3. Make sure your first number, one of your numbers is from the list on the right, minus, there's my 4, square root of 27, I'm going to break that two numbers that multiply equals 27. I'm going to call that 9 times 3. Now looking at the first one, square root of 4 is 2. So it becomes a whole number. This 2 with the 4 that was already there, that gives me 8 radical 3. Minus, square root of 9 is 3. This 3 times the 4 that was there is 12 radical 3. Now that they have the same radical, I'm just going to call this negative 4 radical 3. Now let's take a look at another example. Let me distribute that radical 5. Radical 5 times radical 6, that gives me square root of 30. Square root of 5 times 1, that gives me 1 square root of 5. Notice how the 1 at the front of my square root, it's optional, so I didn't write it. Now let me distribute the 3. So it's going to give me 3 radical 6. Remember, radical with radical, you can multiply it. Whole number with whole number, you can. Now, a whole number with a radical, you just write both of them. Lastly, 3 times 1. It's 3. I look at my radicals. If I can simplify one of them, I would so. In this case, I cannot. If I can combine any like terms, I would do it as well. In this case, I cannot. Let's take a look at this other example. Let me distribute the 7. A whole number with a radical, I cannot combine them, so I write both of them. A 7 times the square root of 2 is just 7 square root of 2. I cannot combine them. Now here, when I combine this, I'm going to go, because the radical with the radical, I'm going to have a negative radical 15. Notice I multiply them. Now here, negative times a positive, I still get negative square root of 6. The signs, don't forget my signs. Now, I see the radicals, I cannot simplify any of them. I cannot combine any of them. So that's all I get. Now let's take a look at this one. Let me distribute the square root of 10. Square root of 10 times square root of 10. They're radicals. Let me start by calling that square root of 100. Notice I multiply the two numbers. Now here I have minus square root of 30. Right? They're both radicals, so I can multiply them. Now let me multiply this one. So that gives me plus square root of 30. Then positive times a negative gives me a negative square root of 9. Now there's a few things that are pretty interesting. The two terms in the center, negative square root of 30, positive square root of 30. I don't need to know what the square root of 30 is, but I know the same number as a negative and a positive. In addition, they cancel out. The first part, square root of 100, I know that's 10. minus the square root of 9, I know that's 3. A little bit split, but this thing looks like 10 minus 3. So I'm just going to call it 7. Now this little 2 on the top, my exponent, what it means is I have the same parentheses twice. Now do me a favor and do not distribute. Don't think that you can distribute the 2. That would happen only if it's multiplication on the inside. But because of the minus sign, right, addition or subtraction, you cannot distribute. So don't do that. Right? I literally wrote the same parentheses twice. So let me start by multiplying these. That gives me square root of 49 minus 3 square root of 7. Now let me distribute the negative 3. That gives me minus 3 square root of 7 plus 9. All right, so the square root of 49, that's basically 7. So when it comes to combining like terms, I have 7 plus 9. I'm just going to call that 16. Now the 2 terms in the center, they don't cancel out. However, they become negative 6 radical 7. They had the same radical, so I combined them. Negative 3 minus 3 gave me negative 6. So that's what I get. Now let's take a look at this one. Let me distribute the 5. 5 times 5 is 25. 5 times a radical, right? A whole number with a radical I cannot combine. So I'm just going to call that plus 5 cube root of 3. Now let me distribute this one. Keep in mind, keep an eye on your sign. So that's going to give me negative 5 cube root of 3. And then here will give me negative cube root of 9. All right, don't forget to multiply it 3 times 3. All right, so I noticed that the 2 terms in the middle, they cancel out. So I'm just going to have 25 minus the cube root of 9. Cube root of 9, I cannot simplify. That stays as a radical. A whole number with a radical I cannot combine. So just leave it at that. Now, this is for you guys to try at home. The answers for these are included. So again, this is for you guys to try at home. Some more examples. Those are the answers. Now we're going to rationalize a denominator. Here's the rule. We can read the rule, but what the mumbo jumbo says is that if I give you guys a fraction with the denominator at the bottom, so basically we're going to divide by a radical, I'm going to multiply this fraction by 1. I know 1 can be written as a fraction as long as I write the same thing on the top and the same thing at the bottom. So I'm going to multiply this, both top and bottom, by square root of 7. I know multiplication by 1, multiplied by 1 doesn't change the answer. And a fraction, as long as the top and bottom are the same, it's a 1. So now looking at the top, 3 times square root of 7, I cannot combine them. So I'm just going to call it 3 square root of 7. Now looking at the bottom, square root of 7 times square root of 7, we start by calling it square root of 49. But square root of 49 becomes 7. Now notice I don't have a radical anymore, at least at the bottom. I don't have a radical at the bottom. On the top, I can have it. Make sure if you have one on the top, make sure you simplify it. And also take a look at your fraction. Your whole numbers, 3 over 7. If you can simplify them, then do so. In this case, we cannot. Looking at example B, let me multiply it, top and bottom, by square root of 5. So that gives me 5 square root of 10 over 5. Notice how here I multiplied the radicals. At the bottom, I started by calling square root of 25 because I multiplied them, but square root of 25 is 5. Do look at your fraction. if you can simplify it, 5 over 5 cancels out. So I just get square root of 10. On my answer, it's okay if I have a radical, just it's not okay if I have it at the bottom. So no radicals at the bottom of the fraction. Let's take a look at this one. Let me simplify the bottom first, though. I'm thinking square root of 12. I'm going to think of that as 4 times 3. So I have this as negative 6 on top. And at the bottom, I have 2 radical 3. Right, I simplified it a little, just that way I deal with smaller numbers. Let me multiply top and bottom by radical 3. So I have negative 6 radical 3 over, this looks like 2 radical 9 to begin with, looking at the bottom. But radical 9 is 3, so that becomes a 6. Now here my 6's cancel out. So I get negative square root of 3. Once again, it's okay to have a radical at the bottom, just not on top. Alright, so let's continue. This is for you guys to try at home. These are the answers. This is what you guys should get. Let me work this one out. Let me simplify things out first. The negative sign, remember I'm going to break this as square root of 18 over square root of 125. I'm going to break it as a fraction of 2 radicals. Sorry for the background, that's my son. Now, let's take a look. The top, square root of 18, there's a negative sign. Remember, I brought the number that was at the front, I bring it to the top. I'm going to call that square root of 9 square root of 2. Now at the bottom, I'm going to break that as 25 times 3. I simplify each of my radicals if possible. So at the moment, I have negative 3 square root of 2 over 5 square root of 3. I have to get rid of the radical at the bottom. So let me multiply top and bottom by radical 3. I'm interested in getting rid of the radical. So now I have negative 3 radical 6 on top. Here to begin with, this looks like 5 square root of 9, but square root of 9 is 3, so I have a 15 at the bottom. Simplify your fraction if you can. Looking at the whole numbers, negative 3 over 15, I'm just going to call this a negative square root of 6 over 5. My fraction, 3 over 15, I called it 1 over 5. But the 1 outside of my radical, it's optional. So I chose not to write it. Now let's take a look at this example. So I'm going to begin with, I'm going to break it as a fraction of 2 radicals. So I have square root of 50 and square root of m to the 4th. As a matter of fact, I'm going to split already. Letters on their cells. And then numbers with numbers and letters with letters. And then here I have the square root of p to the 5th. All right, so let me simplify. Square root of 50, the number on the top, I'm going to break that as 25 times 2. I'm looking for a perfect square. Now, letter-wise, m to the 4th, I'm just going to leave it at that. Now, at the bottom, I'm just going to call that square root of p to the 5th. I know that's a 5. So numbers-wise, on the top, I have 5 square root of 2. Letter on the top, m to the 4th, that's basically the root is 2. Remember, I always go exponent divided by root. So that gives me m to the 2nd. And then at the bottom, I have p to the 2nd and square root of p. Now, let me rearrange things a little. Let me have the radical at the very end. So I have 5m squared radical 2 over p squared radical p. Like I said, I'm interested in just having the radical by itself. Then I have to get rid of the radical from the bottom. So let me multiply top and bottom by radical p. So that gives me 5m squared radical 2p. Now here, there's the p squared at the front. This, we can see it as the square root of p squared, which just becomes p. So at the end here, I'm going to have a p to the third at the bottom. All right, we're going to have a few more examples like these. So now let's see. This is for you guys to try at home. And these are the answers. Now let's work on this one. I'm dealing with cube roots now. First of all, let me start by breaking it into a fraction of two radicals. I have this as the cube root of 27th and the cube root of 16th. I'm dealing with cubes, so make sure you know your perfect cubes. I know 2 to the third is 8, 3 to the third is 27, 4 to the third 64, 5 to the third is 125, on and on. So to begin with, the top, the cube root of 27, that's 3. The bottom, the cube root of 16 is the cube root of 16, right? 16 is not a perfect cube. Now, I want to make sure I get rid of the radical. In order for me to get rid of the radical, I'm going to multiply top and bottom by radical 4. Seems like a random number, but I'm going to show you guys in a minute why. So let's start by multiplying the top. I have 3 cube root of 4. Now at the bottom, I have the cube root 16 times 4, because I have to multiply those, is 64. Now you guys might see why I chose a 4. My idea, the reason why I chose a 4 is I needed to multiply 16 by something such that it was going to give me one of my numbers from the right. So I said, oh, 16 times 4. That's why I chose the 4. It was not just a random number. It's just that I wanted the bottom to be a perfect cube. So now I have 3 cube root of 4 on the top, and at the bottom, I have a 4. Once again, I wanted to make it a perfect cube at the bottom. Now, let's take a look at this one. You guys are to try this at home. Your answers are going to be that. Now, let's take a look at this other case. What if at the bottom, I have a plus sign or a minus sign? Now, how do I get rid of that? Let me start by multiplying by a fraction, but my fraction is going to be 1 minus the square root of 2. Notice that my plus sign, I changed it to a minus sign. Now let's take a look. Let's take a look in the top. Let me multiply the 3 to the parentheses. That's going to give me 3 minus 3 radical 2. Now looking at the bottom, let me start by distributing the 1 from the first parentheses to the second parentheses. So it's going to give me 1 times 1 is 1 minus the square root of 2. Then let me distribute the radical 2. So that's going to give me plus radical 2 minus radical 4. The two terms in the center, funny thing, they cancel out. Now the square root, it becomes a 2. So on the top, I have a 3 minus 3 radical 2. At the bottom, if I simplify this a little, it looks like 1 minus 2. So let me call that minus 1. Now, I don't have a radical at the bottom. However, I can get rid of the fraction by dividing everything by negative 1. So I'm just going to have a negative 3 plus 3 radical 2. Right? Keep in mind, I distribute the negative sign. So that's why some changes of signs were there, just so I can get rid of the fraction. You don't have to get rid of the fraction, I just got rid of the fraction because there was a 1 at the bottom. Now in this case, for example, B, let me multiply top and bottom by 4 plus radical 3. Notice that I switched the sign from the minus to a plus. Okay, so let's take a look on the top. Let me distribute the 5. So it's going to give me 20 plus 5 radical 3. Looking at the bottom, let me distribute the 4 first. So it's going to give me 16 plus 4 radical 3. Let me distribute the negative radical 3. So it's giving me negative 4 radical 3 minus the square root of 9. The two terms in the center cancel out. Now the bottom looks like 16 minus 3. All right, the square root of 9 is 3. So I have 20 plus 5 radical 3 over 13th. I look at my whole numbers. If I can divide them all by the same thing, I would do so. In this case, I cannot. So I would leave it at that. My math lab, sometimes it says, well, on the top, you could have divided each by 5. So it wants you to factor out the 5 from the top. And then you write 4 plus the radical 3 over 13th. But that's my math lab. I don't mind you not factoring out the 5. So I'll just leave it at that. Let's take a look at a couple more examples. I'm going to multiply top and bottom by square root of 5 minus square root of 3. Once again, the plus sign, I change it to minus. It's okay if I have multiple radicals. Let's take a look at the top. Let me distribute the radical 2. So that's going to give me radical 10 minus radical 6. Then let me distribute the negative radical 3. And that's going to give me negative radical 15th plus radical 9. Okay, so looking at the bottom now, let me start by distributing the radical 5. So that gives me radical 25 minus radical 15th. Now let me distribute the radical 3 to the second parentheses. It's going to give me plus radical 15th minus radical 9. All right, so when I see the top, I see a perfect square. And then I see my other radicals. There's not much I can do. So I'm just going to have radical 10 minus radical 6 minus radical 15th plus 3. At the bottom, those twos cancel out. So I have 5 minus 3. So I'm just going to write a 2 at the bottom. Now looking at example D, I'm going to multiply top and bottom by radical 5m plus radical p. So radical 5m plus radical p. Notice the minus sign, I changed it to plus. So let me multiply the 3 on the top. So I have 3 radical 5m plus 3 radical p.
1, 2, 3.
Now looking at the bottom, that gives me radical 25m squared plus radical 5mp. Now let me distribute the negative radical p. So it gives me minus radical 5mp minus the square root of p squared. So when I see the top, there's nothing I can do. I'm just going to call this 3 square root of 5m plus 3 square root of p. Plus 3 square root of p. At the bottom, square root of 25m squared, that's 5m. The two terms in the middle cancel out, and then I have minus p. So I'm just going to write this as 5m minus p. That is okay. However, my math lab, it might say, well, notice how on the top you have a 3? Just call that a 3, factor out the 3, square root of 5m plus p over 5m minus p. It might ask you to factor out the 3. When it comes to the test or quizzes, I don't mind you factoring or not factoring the 3. That's why I boxed both answers, because I'm okay with both answers. Now this is for you guys to try at home, and this should be your answers. And let's take a look at our last example, last slide. Now here, we're going to simplify radicals. When I look at the whole numbers, we're going to, if we can divide them all by the same thing, in this case, let me divide everything by 2. So I'm going to have 3 plus the square root of 5. Notice how the one at the front is optional, over 2. Notice how I divided everything by 2. When I mean everything, I'm just talking about my whole numbers, not the radicals, the whole numbers. Now looking at example B, let me simplify my radical first. So on the top I have 5y minus, I see this as the square root of 4 times the square root of 2. Notice how my number, I broke it as 4 times 2, because I wanted one of them to be a perfect squared, and then the square root of y squared. So when I see this, I have a 2 in the front, a y, and square root of 2 over 6y. Okay. Now I'm going to see that everything that has a y, so let me factor out the y. Let me take it out. Let me divide everything by y. So I'm just going to take it out. So I have 5 minus 2 radical 2 over 6. My whole numbers cannot be divided anymore, so I'm just going to leave it at that. All right, I took out the y. Everything had a y, so I just divide everything by y. This is for you guys to try at home. And this is what you guys should get. Right? Any questions, feel free to email me.